We are just getting started here at CCNE. Just as a reminder to mute yourself as you join. Okay. All right. I think we're ready to get started. I see people still joining. We have almost 250 people here, so I think we should go ahead and get started. It's 1:03 p.m. Eastern Time. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jennifer Butlin, and I'm the Executive Director of the Commission on Collegiate Nursing Education. And this is our third webinar in a 4-webinar series addressing the 2024 CCNE Standards for Accreditation of Baccalaureate and Graduate Nursing Programs. Today, we will be focusing on the 4th standard. And just as a reminder, our final webinar in the series will be addressing Standard 3, and it will be on December 11th at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. So if you don't already have that on your calendar for December 11th at 1 p.m. Eastern, we hope you'll come back next week to learn about Standard 3. Before we go on and share some knowledge about Standard 4, I'd like to introduce our presenters. Today, I am joined by Dr. Lori Escalier, who is Dean and Professor at the College of Nursing, the State University of New York Downstate Health Sciences University. Welcome, Dr. Escalier. We also have Dr. Frank Hicks, who is Associate Dean for Academic Programs and Affairs, Professor of Adult Health and Gerontological Nursing at the College of Nursing at Rush University in Chicago. I'm also joined by Priya Lorenzen, our staff, so please do ask questions. We want this to be an interactive session, and we want all members of our audience to have the opportunity to ask questions by typing them in the chat, or you should also feel free during the question and answer portion to unmute your mic, turn your camera on, and ask a question live orally if you prefer to do so. So we will have both opportunities available. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Daniel Mikulski, who is CCNE's Director of Accreditation Services. Thank you, Dr. Mikulski, for arranging the webinar series and for being our lead contact for programs that have questions about standards, implementation, and interpretation. So with that, I have on the next slide an announcement that I'd like to share. And I'd just like to remind folks that the information about participating in CCNE's webinar series can be viewed here on the CCNE website. You'll see that you can join next week's webinar from the purple call-out box there. And you will also be able to access the archived webinars there. So for example, if you didn't have an opportunity to view the Standard 1 and Standard 2 webinars in recent weeks, you can access the archived versions here. As well, if you are unavailable on December 11th for the Standard 3 webinar, you can access it back here. Today's webinar will be archived and posted on the CCNE website by this Friday. So if you have other colleagues who couldn't join, or if you have to drop off early, you'll be able to view it here. In terms of the CCNE accreditation connection, which is in the teal colored call out box at the bottom of your screen, this is a special initiative that CCNE has launched this fall. We will be doing live let's call them community meetups that are pre-scheduled, but they are live on various topics of interest. And if you go to this call out box called CCNE Accreditation Connection and click Learn More, you'll be able to see programming that is coming up after the new year. We have programming that's relevant to entry to practice nurse residency programs, nurse practitioner fellowship and residency programs. And most importantly for this audience, we have information that's relevant to our baccalaureate and graduate nursing education program constituents. We offered a webinar a couple of weeks ago on certificate programs pursuing accreditation, specifically postgraduate APR and certificate programs. And it was very well attended, and it was important, particularly for any program that has a postgraduate APR and certificate program that is not yet accredited. It was very well attended by that audience. If you do have a postgraduate APR and certificate program that is not accredited, please contact Dr. Mikulski as soon as possible to talk about options for your program. And other programs that we'll have through Accreditation Connection in 2025 include how to prepare to submit your continuous improvement progress report. We'll have one focusing on substantive change notifications. We'll have one for new applicants. And those are just some examples of content we'll be offering. So with that said, let's proceed to the next slide. And I know that Dr. Escalera will be kicking us off. And before we get into their presentation today, I would like to share that Dr. Escalera is a member of the CCNE Board of Commissioners representing Chief Nurse Administrators, and she was also elected by the board to serve as chair of the board in 2025. So congratulations on that important election and role, Lori, that you'll be holding in 2025. Dr. Escalera also co-chairs the Report Review Committee that is responsible for reviewing many monitoring reports that are submitted. And she served as a member of the Standards Committee that resulted in the development of the 2024 standards, which is this document, which is what programs will be using after January 1st of 2025 when hosting on-site evaluations and submitting reports to CCNE. Dr. Hicks also has been a member of the Report Review Committee for CCNE, served on the most recent Standards Committee, and I should mention that both of our presenters today have experience hosting an on-site evaluation and leading CCNE teams that conduct on-site evaluations. So please take advantage of these wonderful volunteers who have a lot of experience and involvement with CCNE in different capacities, and get your questions answered today about Standard 4 in the 2024 Standards for Accreditation. So with that, Lori, would you like to kick off our presentation today?
Yes, thanks, Jen. And hello, everyone, and happy Wednesday. It's a pleasure to be with you today to give an overview of Standard 4. So with that, Standard 4 is about how the program successfully fulfills its mission and goals as demonstrated by the achievement of its expected outcomes. Now, these outcomes encompass student achievements, aggregate faculty performance outcomes, and other program-specific outcomes that you design and you monitor. This standard also requires that data on program effectiveness are utilized to drive your continuous quality improvements to enhance your overall program quality. So we will be addressing all 10 key elements inherent in Standard 4. But first, let's look at the substantive changes to Standard 4. So on this slide, you will see that the first bulleted item provides clarification to the key element 4C. The reason for the additional language about other nursing licensure examination is that it provides clarity specifically for the pre-licensure programs that CCNE accredits in places like Puerto Rico and Lebanon, for example. So licensure pass rates for exams other than the NCLEX RN need to be provided. Regardless of which nursing licensure exam a graduate may take, the program must present the data. Now, in the second and third bulleted items, these address the challenges that programs faced when students wait several years before taking pre-licensure exams or certification exams. So we all know what happens when students wait too long. They fail. The issue here is that after several years, the program has most likely made quality improvements to the curriculum or other aspects of programming, and the failure is not reflective of the current program offerings. So this modification allows you to exclude test takers who graduated more than 2 years before taking the exam. This option provides you with additional flexibility to calculate your NCLEX or certification pass rates. Now, if we take a look at the fourth bulleted item, you will notice that CCNE has increased the expected level of achievement for employment rates from 70% to 80%. Now, this was done after CCNE reviewed data and feedback from constituents, and upon reviewing recent data provided by CCNE accredited programs, as well as pre-pandemic employment rates, and in consideration that there has been a nursing shortage, most programs have employment rates upwards of 90%. So CCNE determined that the increase from 70% to 80% is reasonable, is achievable at every program level. So now I would like to turn this over to Dr. Hicks, because he will now set the stage.
Thank you, Lori. Greetings, everyone. Glad that you're here. I was very thrilled to be asked to do this. I'm sort of an accreditation geek, and I'm even more of an outcomes geek. So I was very pleased when they asked me to do Standard 4. I feel like it's kind of one of my specialty areas. So Standard 4 is all about outcomes. It's all that it's just, how do you specify them? How do you measure them? And what do you do with the results that you get? So what exactly is an outcome? A program outcome is what results from some activity undertaken by the nursing program. For example, it can be the students derive some level of satisfaction because of their affiliation with the nursing program, and the outcome then would be the student's level of satisfaction with that program. Program outcomes can relate to students, to faculty, to alumni, or to any other group the program wishes to include in identifying its outcomes. There are several outcomes that CCNE requires because of Department of Education requirements, but there's a lot of flexibility for programs in identifying what their faculty outcomes will be and what their student outcomes, other program outcomes will be to demonstrate the quality of their program. And I think that's an important point to make, because identifying outcomes that are unique to your program really help your program to shine. So when you're thinking about what kind of outcomes you want to demonstrate, what kind of outcomes you want to start measuring, think about what is unique to our program. What can we do that nobody else does? And then develop an outcome that you can then use to showcase that data. Data for outcomes can be quantitative, they can be qualitative, they can be presented in individual formats, or they can be demonstrated by group formats, and we call that the aggregate. So when you hear that term aggregate, it means being presented as a group. So let's go to the next slide, please. So the important thing, what I like to think about when I'm developing outcomes is I start thinking about, how we tell the nursing students when they're developing their care plans to do SMART goals. I think about us doing SMART goals, right? SMART goals for our outcomes. We have to make sure that the outcome is specific, that it's measurable, and that it's observable. Okay, so what do we mean by that? It's when you specify to whom the outcome applies, what kind of a measure are you going to use, or how are you operationalizing a particular concept such as satisfaction, and then what is the observable? In other words, what kind of result do you expect to get? And we'll get into expected outcomes in a little bit here. So on this slide, you see that you can, we have two examples. The first one is that the alumni from the baccalaureate degree program in nursing will express satisfaction with overall program effectiveness and in meeting expected learning outcomes at 80% or higher on the alumni survey. That's very, very specific. It's telling you who you're tapping into, the tool that you're going to use, what you're measuring in terms of program effect, in terms of satisfaction with program effectiveness and meeting the student learning outcomes, and the level at which you expect to see that level of satisfaction, which is 80%. Contrast that then with the other example, which is upon graduation, students will be better citizens of the world. Well, what students are we talking about here? Who are we talking about? If your program has multiple, if your school has multiple programs, master's, bachelor's, doctoral, whatever, we have no idea. The reviewers will not have any idea who you're talking about in terms of the students. So what students are you talking about? And then how do you measure being a better citizen of the world? How would you be able to do that? How would you even get at that data? So this second example really doesn't meet the criteria of being specific, measurable, and observable. Next slide, please. So then we get into the idea of an expected level of achievement and an actual level of achievement, or we would say the expected outcome and the actual outcome. So the expected outcome is what you expect, or what you desire, or what you predetermine as the benchmark or the goal that you want to hit for a particular outcome. So in the previous example, they set 80% as their expected outcome for student satisfaction. The actual level of achievement then is exactly what the data shows that your program achieved on that particular outcome. So let's say, for example, using the previous example, that you set it at 80% and you got an 88%. That 88% of your students, I said that they were satisfied with the program and attaining the student learning outcomes. Well, then you met your expected level of achievement. Indeed, you actually exceeded it at 88%. Key elements 4B, 4C, 4D, and 4E has already set levels of achievement or rates. We'll get into that in a little bit, as required by the U.S. Department of Education. And these will be, we'll explicate those a little bit later as we move through the presentation. Okay, next slide, please. You will see that the language in the accreditation standards refers to completion or completers. And so what do we mean by that? So sometimes people get confused. Why are you using that? Does that mean graduates? What exactly does that mean? CC&E uses this terminology because technically a student doesn't graduate from a certificate program. They complete the certificate program. A student who graduates from a degree program, though, has also completed their program. So the term completer is a more broad umbrella term that encompasses not only students who graduate from a degree program, but also students who complete a certificate program. So that's why you'll see that terminology used. Don't throw you off. All right, let's go on and start getting into the meat of Standard 4. So Standard 4 is very important. It is very difficult to move through the rest of the standard if you're not meeting this particular key element. And why is that? because this key element speaks to your systematic process for collecting data for your program effectiveness. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the SEP or the SEP, the Systematic Evaluation Plan. This can take many forms. I've seen it done many ways. I've seen this information presented in many ways. But what the reviewers are going to be looking for are some very specific elements that must be included in the systematic evaluation plan. And those all programs under consideration must be addressed in this process. So the process for your evaluation plan must be written. It must be ongoing. In other words, you use it consistently. And I think that's an important part. You know, systematic evaluation plans shouldn't be developed and then put in the drawer until it's time for accreditation. Then you pull them out and say, oh, are we doing this? No, they really do help you keep up with the information that you need to be collecting so that you are making sure that your program is on the mark and that you are getting the evaluation data that you need. So it should be ongoing. It needs to address what constitutes achievement for the program outcomes. The plan must also be comprehensive. That means that it's comprehensive in nature. It looks at all outcomes for your program: faculty outcomes, student outcomes, completion rates, certification rates, graduation rates, employment rates, those kinds of things. And you need to specify whether what data you're using. Are you using qualitative or quantitative data? What tools are you using to collect that data? And it also needs to be identified. And you also additionally need to identify the timelines for data collection and the timelines for the review and the analysis. Now, what we'll see sometimes is that programs will include the analysis with their systematic evaluation plan. CC&E does not require that you include the analysis, but you have to identify the timelines when the data is collected, when it is analyzed. And then finally, there has to be evidence that this plan has been periodically reviewed and or revised as appropriate. And that can be documented in several areas. CC does not prescribe where that gets documented, just that this process is documented somewhere. Some individuals will put it on the bottom of their systematic evaluation plan, where they'll say, you know, last reviewed such and such a date, or updated such and such a date. And some programs will put it in their minutes related to either their curriculum committees or their evaluation committees. So CC&E doesn't care where it's documented as long as it has been documented. All right, let's get into key element 4B then. And this all relates to completion rates, okay? Obviously, if you don't have individuals who've completed the program, this is not applicable to you. So it's important that you understand that completion rates are documented by program, not by track. And I think there's some confusion that comes in because later on when we talk about licensure rates, those do have to be documented by track and site and whatnot, but not these completion rates. Completion rates must be documented by program. So you may want to collect data on your tracks, on your various tracks. For instance, if you have a traditional BSN and an accelerated BSN and a master's entry, you may definitely want to collect data on those individual tracks. But when you report it to CC&E, they have to be combined by program. So you would combine them for the baccalaureate program and then for the master's entry program. Then there are a number of ways that you can calculate the completion rates to demonstrate the effectiveness of your program. CC&E allows this because they know that things happen, right? History happens, and sometimes there might be some glitches in your completion rate. And so they provide you with a variety of ways that you're able to demonstrate that your program is effective in helping students to get through the program effectively. This key element is required by USDE, and CC&E wants to facilitate program success. So that is why, and that's why this particular key element is being required. I think what's important is that you want to make sure that you don't combine data for master's and postgraduate certificate programs. Those programs are considered separate programs, and each program needs to be identified separately with this particular key element. So there are 4 ways that you can demonstrate effectiveness and document the completion rates here. You can either do it by the most recent calendar year, and realize the calendar year always refers to January 1st through December 31st, and that the benchmark for that is 70% or higher. You can do it by the completion rate is 70% or higher over the most 3 recent calendar years. And I would like to say we're actually on number 2 now. Daniel, listen to me. There we go. I want to say something a little bit about this. It might seem obvious, but what we have seen, or what I have seen on several occasions in the RRC, is when people are using this particular formula, they will take the average of the percent and you use that to calculate their 3-year average. So for instance, if year 1 was 70% and year 2 was 68% and year 3 was 69%, they'll take those 3 percentages, add them and divide them, and that's their average. That's not the way that you want to do this. You really want to use your raw data, your actual numbers for those particular years to create to calculate your average across those 3 years. So option number 3 then is that the completion rate is 70% or higher for the most recent calendar year when excluding students who have identified factors such as family obligations, relocation, financial barriers, they decided to change their major or to transfer to another institution of higher education. So this is really like looking at option 1 and adding this codicent here of, here are some exceptions of why people left this program. People were not leaving this program primarily for academic reasons. They had other reasons, and we want to declare these as exceptions. Similarly, for option number 4, the completion rate is 70% or higher over the most 3 recent calendar years when excluding students, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the same kinds of exclusions. So you really have 4 options that you can use to demonstrate program effectiveness in terms of your completion rates. So let's talk about the next slide for CCNE. What does CCNE mean by a completion rate? So it's those who have completed the postgraduate APR and certificate program, and those who have graduated from the nursing degree program. So if they have not completed the program, and have been awarded their certificate, or if they have not been awarded their degree, then they should not be included in these completion rates. So it's only for individuals who have truly completed those programs. Let's go to the next one. So just again, a friendly reminder, the completion rates are presented by calendar and not academic year. That's another thing that we'll often see sometimes, is that people will think about it, oh, it's a year, so it's got to be an academic year. No, it's a calendar year, January 1st to December 31st. In the event that you exclude students from program completion rates, the program needs to provide the program needs to provide the number of students that were excluded, as well as the reasons those students were excluded, as per the exceptions presented earlier. So just remember that you're presenting completion rates that are based on your sound data and evidence for the completion of these students. So let's go to the next one. Here are some examples that meet CCNE's expectations. The completion rate for the program under review is 70% or higher for the most recent calendar year, even if the completion rate for an individual track, assuming you have multiple tracks, is less than 70%. So this could be used for instance, in a baccalaureate program. So let's say that you have a traditional BSN and accelerated BSN. If the track meets 70% or greater, they have met this key element. Okay, there would be no compliance concern for this key element. Similarly, if we look at the next one, the completion rate for the program is less than 70% for the most recent calendar year, but is 70% or higher over the 3 most recent calendar years. So you may have a glitch in 1 year, but if the 3 most recent calendar years are 70% or higher, then you have met this key element. There would be no compliance concern. And then finally, the completion rate for the program is less than 70% for the most recent calendar year, but is 70% or higher when excluding students with all of these particular elaborations here, and that the program has provided the supporting documentation that they have analyzed that data and excluded those students as appropriate. So here's a question for the group. Can different programs under review use a different method to calculate completion rates? And the answer to that is yes, you may. You may use a different different ways of calculating completion rates for different programs. So you could use one method for the baccalaureate program, and one method for the master's program, and one method for the DNP. So that is a possibility.
I would like to further clarify, Frank, that just in terms of terminology that programs use, some people call their family nurse practitioner track an NP program. And so just to further clarify what Frank said, which is indeed accurate, that the overall program can choose different ways from each program to calculate that different tracks. Would you like to talk a little bit about different tracks and how that might be different?
Right. So
compared to overall program.
So for instance, at our school, our DNP program has 14 different tracks. So when we're going through accreditation, we have to present the completion rates by the DNP program, not by individual tracks. So even though I have 14 tracks and we have an FNP and whatnot, and we even call them programs, we'll call it the FNP program, or we'll call it, the PNP program, whatever. That it's not a program, and I'm trying to get that out of the faculty's head. It's not a program, it's a track. We have one program, which is the DNP program, and that's what we need to base this key element on, is that program, the DNP program.
Yeah. So obviously, just staying on that point, an overall DNP program that needs to present its completion rate to CCNE needs to present the completion rate for the overall DNP program. However, in order to come up with that calculation, the program will first have to look at what the calculation is for each of its tracks in order to come up with the overall DNP completion rate. But CCNE does not need the completion rates for each of the 14 individual tracks that Frank's program has, for example. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah.
Good.
So it's very similar to when we were talking about when you're calculating these completion rates, you have to look at the entirety of the data. It's not just this particular piece of it or that particular piece of it. It'd be across all of your tracks. I think that's what you're trying to say, right, Jennifer? Yeah, right. Okay. All right, let's go to the next slide. So again, this is about nursing licensure pass rates, demonstrate program effectiveness. And as Lori said at the beginning of the presentation, this not only includes NCLEX, but this might include other nurse licensing examinations that a program could use based upon their location. So for instance, the two best examples are Puerto Rico and Lebanon. And the other thing that's important to remember here is that if you don't have anyone who's taken the licensing exam yet, then this would not be applicable. This would not be an applicable key element that you would necessarily use. So now this is a little bit different, okay? Because we were emphasizing before that everything's done by the track. I mean, done by the program, done by the program, done by the program. Well, licensure pass rates are a little bit different. Licensure pass rates are provided by each campus or site and track individually. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say that you have a BSN program and you have two sites for that BSN program. You have your home site and you have, a site down the road. You have to present the licensure pass rates for both of those sites, not combine them. They have to be individually presented. Similarly, if you have a BSN program, a traditional BSN program, an accelerated BSN program, you have to present those separately. So because they're two different tracks. So we do not want the licensure pass rates to be combined. We want them to be separate by track. So another example would be, let's say that you have that traditional BSN program and that accelerated BSN program. And let's say that you have a master's entry program and you have all three of those programs at two different sites. Then we would need to see those licensure pass rates for all of those programs, all three programs at both sites, separated out, not combined. Does that make sense? Okay. Which one are we at? Okay, so that said, there are, I think I said, so that said, there are really four ways that you can demonstrate the licensure pass rates of 80%. And you can choose to do these in any way that you want. You just have to be able to identify to the reviewers which method you chose. The pass rate for each campus or site and track is 80% or higher for first-time takers for the most recent calendar year. Again, it's by calendar year, not academic year. The pass rate for each campus or site and track is 80% or higher for all takers, first-time and repeaters who pass for the most recent calendar year. The pass rate for each campus, site, track is 80% or higher for all first-time takers over the three most recent calendar years. And then finally, the pass rate for each campus, site, and track is 80% or higher for all takers, first-time and repeaters who pass over the three most calendar years. Okay, so you can choose any of these options that you want to be able to. And also remember that the program, and this is new as of these standards, that the program can exclude test takers who take the licensure exam more than 2 years after the program completion, which is under review. So if they graduated 3 years before and they're still trying to take the NCLEX exam, you can exclude them from the calculation for your pass rate. And also, different options can be used for different campuses or different tracks. So you might use, let's say you have a BSN program and an accelerate program and a master's entry program. You could use a different option to calculate the pass rates for each of those tracks. It's, again, up to the program when what best benefits the program. So let's go to the next slide, please. So let's keep in mind that the licensed passenger rate for each campus or site must be 80% or higher. They are calculated and provided based on calendar year, and the program identifies which option provided by CCNE is chosen to calculate that rate. And the way the program calculates the pass rate for each campus and site and track can differ, as long as calculated by using one of the CCNE options, which we just reviewed. But each campus, site, and track is expected to meet CCNE expected level of achievement at 80% or better. And again, you can exclude test takers who take the examination more than 2 years after completion of the program. And let's go on to key element 4D. And this is referring to certification pass rates. And again, this is not applicable if you do not have takers by this. If you do not have certification, if no one has set for the certification examination, or people have not completed the program to be able to sit for the certification examination, you don't have to necessarily repeat This is not applicable. I'm getting all I'm getting all twisted in my words here. So this key element is not applicable to a degree or certificate program that does not prepare students for certification examination or does not yet have individuals who have taken certification examinations. I'm sorry for that foible here. Now, we're going to go on and talk about the specifics of key element 4D. So what's important here is that if you prepare a student for certification in any APRN program or otherwise, it could be like the CNL program. If you prepare them for certification, you have to report those certification pass rates, even if the state where you reside doesn't require certification for practice. CCNE expects that you would still be able to present what the certification pass rates would be for those students. Again, it's like the previous key element. There are 4 ways to demonstrate that effectiveness, and either of those 4 options can be used, but the program has to define the option it's using, and so the reviewers understand which option you've chosen. Also, it's important to remember that you have to separate out the graduate degree students from the certificate program students. CCNE does not want you to combine those. So separate out the graduate degree students from the program students. I'm sorry, for the certificate students, excuse me. And so if we're going through the ways that you can calculate the certification pass rates here, the pass rate for each certification examination is 80% or higher for first-time test takers in the most recent calendar year. These are very similar to the previous ones. The pass rate for each certification examination is 80% or higher for all takers. The pass rate for each certification exam is 80% or higher for all first-time takers over the last 3 most recent calendar years, or the pass rate for each certification examination is 80% or higher for all takers, first time and repeaters who pass over the most three recent years. So there are a couple of other additional points here that we want to bring out for your consideration. That the pass rate data are to be provided by examination for each degree or certificate program. Pass rate data do not need to be reported individually by campus site. And when there are multiple exams that relate to the same role and population focus from different certification organizations, such as the nurse practitioner or the adult nurse practitioner, pass rate data may be combined for those exams. It would be a weighted average of those exams. But again, remember that the data must be separated by program, i.e. master's, postmaster's certificate, and DNP. All those would be reported separately when presenting your certification pass rates. Okay, let's go on and talk to the next slide, please. I'm sorry, go back to the other one. Keep in mind, the one that says keep in mind. There we go. So pass rate data must be provided for each exam, which the program states that it prepares graduates for, whether the exam is required to practice. Certification pass rates are calculated and provided based on a calendar year, and then the program identifies which option it's chosen to calculate those rates. The program must provide certification pass rates data for each exam, but may combine pass rate data if multiple exams relate to the same role and population. And the certification pass rate data are not provided by campus site and track. This only applies to licensure pass rates. So that's a good way to remember it, that individual sites and individual tracks are only reported individually in licensure pass rates. And then the program may exclude test takers who take the certification examination more than 2 years after program completion. Let's talk about employment rates then. So again, if you don't have anybody who's completed the degree or certificate program yet, this key element would not be applicable, obviously. Just a reminder that employment prior to a program is not sufficient to address this particular key element. One of the questions that comes up is, do graduates need to be employed in nursing to be counted in the employment rate? No, not necessarily. The employment rate is just a flat employment rate. They don't necessarily have to be in nursing, but a program may choose to break out non-nursing employed graduates and nursing employed graduates. That's totally up to the program. But but what CCNE expects is that the expected level of achievement of 80% or better is reported for all students, all graduates who are employed. Now, we all know how difficult it is to get this information, and CCNE wants this information collected within 12 months of program completion. And the data are collected at the time of program completion or at any time within the 12 months of completion of the program. So, for instance, what we do is we actually have an exit survey that we give the students prior to them. We call it end of program survey. We give it to them before they leave, and we ask these kinds of questions. So that's how we are able to capture our employment data. And we actually ask a couple of questions. You know, are you currently employed? If so, where are you employed or in what role? And do you already have a job lined up for your new role if they're going to be nurse practitioners and that kind of a thing? So we're able to collect that at the time or near the time that they graduate. CCNE expects that you do a good faith effort at collecting this information. We do understand how difficult it is, but the sooner you can get to the students at the end of their program or soon after their graduation, in my particular experience, the better, the better results you're going to get. Also, although CCNE expects that the employment rate is going to be 80% or higher. If the employment rate is less than 80%, the employment rate you're able to exclude graduates or completers who have elected not to be employed. So, for instance, there might be some people who complete your program or complete their certification program and elect, for whatever reason, they're raising a family, not to be employed. You may exclude those from the calculation. And then let's go on to more about keeping in mind the employment rate is reported for each overall degree certificate program under review, not by track. The data are collected for employment rates within 12 months of completion. You can choose to collect employment data at program entry, but this is not a CCNE requirement and would not satisfy CCNE expectation for this particular key element. So what the students come in with is not adequate to answer this particular key element. The other thing is, do not assume that because students are in a DNP program or that they're an RN to BSN program that they are employed. The CCNE wants actual data as to the actual percentage of students who are employed for this. And then finally, here's an example of an expected outcome and an actual outcome of a key element 4E that we've been talking about. 80% of baccalaureate degree nursing program graduates who seek employment will be employed within 12 months of graduation. And then their actual outcome was that 88% of baccalaureate degree nursing program graduates sought employment were employed within 12 months. So what you would be able to say for this particular outcome is that this particular outcome, this particular key element was met because they met their standard of 80% with an actual outcome of 88%. Any questions that I can answer now?
Well, I can tell you, Frank, there are a lot of questions, and they are really excellent questions that have been typed into the chat. I know that Lori and the staff and I have been monitoring these, and while Lori is presenting the next 5 key elements, I know that Frank will take a look at the chat questions as well, so we can have a discussion around some of these at the end, because we really want to get questions answered. They are fabulous questions, and kudos to Priya Lorenzen for answering them in real time. But I think that we want to also address them orally so that the archive can really reflect the nature of the questions and the answers, because there are more than 300 constituents joining us. I see that not only are there faculty and chief nurse administrators preparing for on-site evaluations or the submission of reports, but we also have some really seasoned evaluators and team leaders who are chiming in on chat, so we appreciate that as well. So let's move on to key element 3F and get through the end of the key elements. And then we're going to open it up for Q&A, which I think is going to be one of the most valuable parts of our time together today. So we encourage folks to stay on for the Q&A and to get your questions answered. Lori?
Okay, thanks, Jen. So we're moving along to key element 4F. And 4F is about how the program uses outcome data regarding completion, licensure, certification, and employment rates for program improvement. So what did you do, perhaps, to address a decline in NCLEX or certification pass rates? You could ask yourself, what measure did you take when completion rates declined? Describe here your quality improvement plans and discuss how faculty were involved in the program improvement process. Now, this is important because we sometimes see some concerns here. And it's never okay to say, oh, guess what, CCNE? We met all expected levels of achievement, so we didn't develop and implement program improvement. So we all know as educators that continuous improvement is a best practice. And improvement isn't just about addressing deficiencies, it's about striving for excellence. So assuming that no further improvement is needed often results in stagnation when a program fails to innovate. So even if outcomes are met, there could be innovative practices or tools or strategies that could enhance your program's quality. So describe how data are used or how these data can improve the program moving forward into the future. Moving along now to key element 4G. 4G is about aggregate faculty outcomes. This key element is not about individual faculty outcomes. It is about aggregate faculty outcomes. And over the years with my work with CCNE, I found that some programs have a hard time determining or defining what an aggregate faculty outcome is. So an aggregate faculty outcome refers to the collective results or performance indicators of the faculty as a group. And these are usually related to teaching, scholarship, research, leadership, service. It's up to you how you define what your aggregate faculty outcomes are. But make sure that your faculty outcomes are identified for the faculty as a group. They specify expected levels of achievement or your benchmarks and reflect expectations of faculty in their roles. And as I said before, these could be in the areas of service, teaching, scholarship, practice, leadership, etc. Now, the next step is to compare the actual outcome to the expected level of achievement. This is the analysis part of this key element. We see compliance concerns for this key element because faculty outcomes might not be presented in the aggregate or the program has failed to assign a clearly measurable expected level of achievement. So if your program uses other types or groups of faculty and the outcomes vary for these groups, please make sure that you include this in your narrative as well. And I believe on the next slide, we have some examples of faculty outcomes. So here you will see that at least 90% of nursing faculty will engage in a professional development activity. The second bulleted item says the amount of revenue generated through faculty practice will increase by 3% over the prior year. The amount of grant funding for the school will increase by 10% over the prior year. And the last example is 75% of nursing faculty will serve on a committee. So when you look at these examples, they all have one thing in common, and that is they all have an assigned expected level of achievement that is clearly measurable. So the outcomes here represent, the first one represents teaching, and then the others represent scholarship, and the last one represents service. So we can move along now to key element 4H. Key element 4H takes the previous key element 4I one step further. So here you must demonstrate that you analyzed your aggregate faculty outcome data and you used your analyses for quality improvements. And that again, the faculty were involved in the quality improvement process. So give examples. For example, what did you do when aggregate faculty outcome analysis indicated that perhaps faculty scholarship was on the decline? What did you do perhaps when faculty teaching scores were on the decline? What did you do to promote faculty excellence? Did you offer faculty workshops or provide additional opportunities, say, for faculty scholarship? Please note in this key element that, and you'll see this in the supporting documentation, that this element asks for 3 years worth of faculty outcome data. And I believe Jen is going to review the supporting documentation towards the end of the presentation. So now moving along to key element 4I, and this is a key element that is often misunderstood, and I will tell you why. So let's take a look at the key elements elaboration statement. This key element asks for program outcomes other, and that's a significant word here, other than the ones you already addressed, specifically those that you addressed in previous key elements related to completion, licensure, certification, and employment. So don't include your analysis here, okay? What you include here is you decide what your other program outcomes are for your programs, and make sure you assign a measurable expected level of achievement to each of your outcomes, and make sure you describe how your outcomes are measured. Then make sure you analyze the actual outcomes against the expected level of achievement to demonstrate that the program overall is achieving its outcomes. Please note here that the word outcomes is in the plural form, and that means that you need more than one program outcome. I would also like to point out that this key element is applicable even if the program does not yet have data at the time of the writing of the self-study document. New programs must articulate a plan for their other program outcomes and how they are going to be measured. So on the next slide, I believe we have some examples of other program outcomes. So the first one we see here is student alumni employer surveys will reflect a score of at least, or that should be a mean score of at least 3 on a 4-point Likert-like scale. At least 25% of baccalaureate students will participate in an honors program, study abroad program, or service learning activity. On exit surveys, at least 20% of baccalaureate students will report an intent to seek graduate education within 5 years. And lastly, the alumni survey documents that 40% of graduates have served in at least one professional leadership role after graduation. And again, what do all of these have in common? All of them have an assigned expected level of achievement. Some of the most common other program outcomes are based on data from alumni surveys, and these may include alumni perceived satisfaction, alumni perceived learning, alumni perceived effectiveness of the program. So you decide what your other programs outcomes are, and you assign expected levels of achievement. We can move on now to key element 4J. Now this key element takes key element 4I a step further, in that you must demonstrate how other program outcome data that you described in the previous key element are used to foster ongoing program improvement. So following your analyses of your outcomes, what did you do to foster program improvements? For example, what changes did faculty develop and implement to foster a quality improvement? And how have you evaluated these improvements for effectiveness? So here you might want to give very, very specific examples from the programs that are being reviewed. And here again, we'll see that it's not sufficient to say expected levels of achievement were met, therefore we didn't have to do anything. As we all know, there's always room for quality improvements. So here's another example. Say that alumni overall program satisfaction was one of your outcomes, and you noted based on your analyses a downward trend. Describe what you did. So did you have, say, additional town hall meetings or meetings with students? Did you distribute a survey to determine the reasons why students might have been dissatisfied with the program? Another example might include improvements to online platforms and pedagogies when overall learning as an other program outcome was affected on analyses. You could reflect on the gaps here and address areas where outcomes were not met and explain action plans for your quality improvements. You can highlight past challenges and how they were resolved. And with that, now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Butlin for her review of supporting documentation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Frank and Lori. We have a lot of great questions we're going to get into, but first, a reminder about the supporting documentation for Standard 4, which is listed on page 27 of the actual standards publication. For Standard 4, there are 6 required sets of documentation. Now, our standards document says that the supporting documentation is included in the self-study document or evaluation resource materials. And you all probably know by now that the evaluation resource materials are now provided electronically at least 7 days prior to the first day of the on-site evaluation. And this is most commonly referred to as a virtual resource room that is made available to the team. And so think about whether these examples of evidence or required documentation areas should be embedded in the self-study itself, for example, in a narrative form or a table, whether it's best to include the information as an appendix, which we would strongly recommend if it's a lengthier document, or whether it should be reserved for the electronic resources, which is the virtual resource room. So let's look at the first three here. One thing I want to emphasize about the systematic written comprehensive process, Frank mentioned already, many of you refer to this as an evaluation plan. I often see SEP as a term or acronym that's used by programs, but we don't prescribe what you call it. What we want to see is what is the process, and it has to be in writing. So make sure that that is presented somewhere for your on-site evaluation team in the materials that you are providing. In terms of examples of periodic review of the systematic process, that could come in many forms. And keep in mind, meeting minutes is listed as an example here, but CC&E doesn't require meeting minutes. Some faculty meet as a faculty of the whole, and there are other ways to document records of actions and review of processes that occur at a nursing program. And so, think about the ways that you can provide examples showing that your systematic process is periodically reviewed. Who's reviewing it, how often, and how are you documenting that? And the third item here is a summary of aggregate student outcomes with comparison of actual levels of aggregate student achievement to expected levels of aggregated student achievement. Often we'll see this as a table. Here's what the actual data results were. Here's what we expected. And then there are some bullets here, which I will not read to you, about what the aggregate student outcome data must include. And obviously, these data are only applicable to a degree program or a certificate program that has completers or graduates. Any thoughts from Frank and Lori on the first three of the supporting documentation areas in terms of ways, best practices, or ways that you recommend presenting the data?
So I always appreciate as a reviewer, even though the systematic evaluation plan, and whatever you want to call it, your comprehensive evaluation plan, can be lengthy. I always appreciate that being presented in the appendix when I'm reviewing a self-study, because it's nice for me to be able to click to flip back to that and make sure that everything that's in that plan is being addressed in the self-study or vice versa. So for me, and this could just be a personal preference, I like to have my hands on that systematic evaluation plan. And I agree with you, Lori. I mean, we do document the review of the systematic evaluation. That's what we call it. We call it the SEP. We do review that on an annual basis in our evaluation committee, and that gets documented in the minutes. But we also document that at the end of the SEP, and we say, reviewed by committee this date, or revised by committee this date, that kind of a thing. I think the important thing with any of this information that gets put into the self-study or into a SIPR is that for people to realize that, the reviewers don't know your program as well as you know your program. So the more clarity you can bring and present your data in an understandable fashion, the easier it'll be for the reviewers to be able to understand it and interpret it.
Yeah, I totally agree with Frank. Standard 4 requires that you present lots of data. So use well-organized tables, use tables to condense detailed data, making it easier to show comparisons and analyses. Organize your data logically and present your data systematically. Keep it simple. Don't overcrowd and add unnecessary data. Use consistent alignment and use headers effectively, use subheadings. I agree also with Frank that it's important to include the systematic evaluation plan in the appendices.
Right.
There's a good question around this, and let's go to the next slide. Just to wrap up supporting documentation, but someone has asked the question about the systematic evaluation process. Is it sufficient to include just the standard 4 data? Or is the expectation to include all standards 1 through 4? Could you all speak to that?
So
yeah, CC&E does not prescribe. Oh,
go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Both of you can speak to it.
Yeah, I was going to say that a CC&E does not prescribe how the evaluation plan is developed. However, if you read the language in the key element, it does say that it is comprehensive, it is written, and so forth. Many programs, in my experience, do align the systematic evaluation plans to CC&E standards and key elements.
And I totally agree with that. And I know when I first started doing this, I've developed a couple of programs, and just my paranoia, I want to make sure that I got everything in, particularly when we were going up for initial accreditation. And I just found it so very easy to develop the SEP around the four standards. And so even though CC does not prescribe it that way, and I have seen programs that have not necessarily used all 4 standards, but what you have to be able to demonstrate is that it is a comprehensive review of your program. That would be important.
Great, thank you both. So these last 3 supporting documentation areas that are required, 4 through 6, are pretty straightforward. We are looking for a summary of aggregate faculty outcomes for the past 3 years. So if you haven't been collecting the faculty outcomes data, you should start now, because we are looking for the past 3 years, not just in the year in which you're hosting an on-site evaluation. So another pitfall to avoid, I think, with standard 4 is this is a standard where if you aren't collecting data for something, then you aren't going to be able to show how you're analyzing the data or comparing your actual data with your expected data. So sometimes in standard 4, unfortunately, we see multiple compliance concerns, because if the program hasn't collected the data, then there are basically automatic compliance concerns for other elements within standard 4, because certainly you haven't been using, analyzing, or comparing the data for improvement purposes if you don't have the data to begin with. So it's very important to look at that. And I think that's an important takeaway for standard 4. When we say the past 3 years, we mean the past 3 years. If you have a process for looking at data every 5 years, completely fine. But for CC&E purposes, we only need you to present for the past 3 years. Any thoughts from our presenters on these last 3 supporting documentation areas? We do have a lot of questions, and I want to get to those next.
I do want to talk about the virtual resource room kind of generally, and also the self-study. I think it's really important to, as Lori said earlier, to think about how you want to organize that virtual resource room and identify to the reviewers how to get to that information. And I think it's really helpful to organize the virtual resource room by standard and by key element, and to clearly identify within the folders, however, whatever system you use, that there's clear identification of the documents that you refer to in your self-study in the key elements. So whatever, I mean, in the key elements. So whatever you identify as document A in your self-study for key element 4G, make sure that it's identified as document A in 4G in your resource room, because that takes a lot of confusion out of the process. And individuals, it's
Right.
really easy for us as reviewers to get confused because we're looking at a massive data as well. So the easier it is for us to trace your thinking back to your data, to your evidence, the better. And I just will reemphasize what Lori said earlier. Your presentation it's all about the presentation, that it's clear, that it's clean, and that it's understandable. So because I know how it is when you get in the midst of these things and you're writing this, and it's just like a manuscript. You'll write a paragraph and you think it's the most understandable paragraph in the world, and then someone else reads it and they, what the heck are you saying here? You know, it's the same thing with the self-study. So I think it's really important to let other people put their eyes on this and make sure that it's clear and easily identified.
Great. Let's, Lori, any final thoughts on supporting documentation?
No, Jen, I think we covered
Great.
it really well.
Let's go to the next slide, which is opening it up to Q&A. And of course, we invite people to turn your video on and ask questions orally if you like, but we do have a lot of questions in chat. So for those who have been able to monitor the chat questions and answers, I think you'll learn a lot there. And if not, I want to address some of these during the live webinar. Let's start with employment rates. Key element 4E. There have been a number of questions that we want to emphasize here. The first thing I want to emphasize is that this is the only quantitative expectation in Standard 4 that CCNE has changed in the 2024 standards. It used to be 70% employment rate. Now it is an 80% employment rate. I know our presenter covered that, but I wanted to emphasize that. So if you are referring back to an old report or self-study that you prepared for CCNE, you are gonna really want to make sure you are using our updated language and understand what the new requirement is for employment rates. We had a few questions around this in chat. One of them is, can employment be outside the field of nursing? And the answer is yes. Can employment be as a nurse, but not necessarily for the specific role that you have just prepared that student for? And the answer is yes. And so hopefully those answers are clear. Now, certainly, Frank gave examples of questions that his institution asks because they think that they're good questions. Where are you working? What's your job? What's your title? You know, have you gotten a promotion since you graduated? You know, these are all questions that a program should feel free to ask. But for CCNE, we need to know, are they employed? Yes or no? And in terms of the timing, some folks asked if they can do a survey. Yes. You can do a survey to get this information. You could have your students at the time of graduation complete a form, an online survey, a form. You could send out an email and ask folks to respond. You could make phone calls and ask people to respond. Many of our programs have found that it's most effective to gather the employment data at graduation or shortly after graduation. You have the ability to wait up to 12 months following graduation, but it's easier. I think the response rates may be lower and it may be harder to get people engaged and to get responses if you wait 12 months. one of the things that we commonly see, not commonly, but it's a common pitfall when programs haven't followed the expectation, that they report that, well, all of our students are employed and we just know that, but there is no data to suggest that the data were gathered or, collected in any way. So we do need to have evidence of data and the collection of data. The second thing is sometimes programs will say that our students were employed at the time of entry or enrollment in the program. And again, that is not allowable. You can certainly ask that question, but that is not sufficient to address this key element for CCNE accreditation purposes. Let me ask Lori and Frank, are you seeing anything else in the chat that hasn't been answered related to employment rates?
I've not seen anything. I've been looking through it, and I think most of them have been answered.
Yeah, I agree.
Graduation surveys are indeed a common mechanism for programs to use to collect this data, but not the only mechanism. Okay, so there are also questions about, I'm sort of clustering them in my mind based on those that I have read. There are a number of questions about program completion, the way that that is calculated, and I just want to know if our presenters have any specific thoughts about that. I think Frank, already discussed that the completion rate is for the overall program, meaning the DNP degree program. You're going to give us one completion rate for the overall program. Somebody asked a question, does CCNE consider our post-baccalaureate and post-master's DNP programs to be two separate programs? No, they're two separate tracks within the DNP program. And so, yes, of course, your students are going to have different times to complete a post-baccalaureate DNP and a post-master's DNP. You're going to have to provide everything requested in key element 4B to figure out what your completion rate is for each of those pathways. And then you're going to calculate what the overall completion is for the program. Any thoughts from Frank and Lori on that and the ways that programs are calculating it or averaging it, doing a weighting average? Thought of that, a weighted average?
We don't do weighted averages. We do straight averages, and we look over 3 years of data. But we actually keep a running. We keep this data on a running basis, an ongoing basis through our data services office. And so, and then we review those outcomes regularly in our evaluation committee meetings. So we don't weight them. We just use straight averages.
And other programs might identify other ways for doing that. Lori, did you have thoughts on that?
No, the only thing I would add is to make sure that the program describes the formula it uses. Oftentimes we'll see a compliance concern because there isn't a clear explanation of how they calculated completion rates.
Very good. Okay. Let's see. There are also, there was a question about someone being interested in examples of how a program with a traditional BSN and an RN to BSN would calculate their completion rate.
It would be the same way you calculated the completion rates for the post-baccalaureate DNP and the post-master's DNP. It's by degree program.
And someone is asking if you select, option 2 for completion rate, which is 70% or higher over the most 3 recent calendar years. do we average the 3 years together? So that's a good question, because we sometimes have questions about that. Notice that it doesn't say in our standards that it has to be an average. But how would you do? It says that the rate has to be 70% higher over the 3 most recent calendar years. So Lori and Frank, how have you seen programs address that when they present 3 years worth of data?
The most common way that I see them do that is they combine the 3 years and look at an average over 3 years. That's the one I'm most familiar with. Lori, have you seen anything else?
No, I haven't. They average the 3 years.
Yeah. But I think I can go back to my other comment. Don't average the percent, average the data. Average the
Yes.
actual numbers. Don't average the percent, right?
Good advice. Good advice. We also had the question about, if a program in 2019 selected one of these options on how to present a completion rate or a pass rate, does that for their let's just say the baccalaureate program, do they have to stick with that over time? Or if they're coming up for a review in 2025, could they say, okay, this time we're going to use option 3 in the standard? So the answer to that is yes. Each time you present a report or a self-study to CCNE, your program can choose the way that it's complying among the options available. So very good. Well, we've answered many of the questions here. I see somebody asked about the platforms programs are using for the virtual resource room in the chat, and a bunch of people typed in that they use various platforms. So that not really related to standard 4, but certainly good information that is being shared by our participants. And someone else has asked a question about the continuous improvement progress report and the template that will be available to constituents. For those of you submitting a CIPR on June 1st of 2025 or December 1st of 2025, you are, of course, going to be addressing the 2024 standards for accreditation that we've been discussing today. And the template for the CIPR preparation is being finalized and will be shared this month. This is December 2024. So for those listening later, I wanted you to know that in December 2024, the CIPR template addressing the new standards will become available. And if you turn to the next slide, Daniel, I'd also like to share that the CCNE self-study template is available addressing the 2024 standards. And of course, you have access to that already through the CCNE online community under resources, as well as through the CCNE website. So with that, we have had many questions in the chat. I'm glad that we were able to answer so many of them. If anyone has questions about your particular nursing program or something that was sensitive that you didn't want to ask during a large live webinar, you should feel free to contact Dr. Daniel Mikulski with your questions. I also want to remind folks, if anyone is attending AACN Transform this week in New Orleans, CCNE will be presenting there on Friday late afternoon. We will be presenting an overview of all 4 of the standards during that session this Friday. So we hope to see some of you there. And again, come back next week on December 11th for our Standard 3 live webinar. Come with your questions. And thank you to all of you for your great engagement today, and particularly our presenters, Dr. Frank Hicks and Lori Escalera. We are appreciative of your time, and we hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.